You're listening to the Sustainable Angler Podcast. I'm your host, Rick Crawford. In this episode, I interview author Mark Kurlansky and his latest book, Salmon, a Fish, and the Earth and the History of Their Common Fate. We kick off the conversation talking a little fishing, then take a deeper dive into the environmental threats to salmon, such as deforestation, insecticides, but mostly climate change, and Mark's aha moment when he looks back through history from the Industrial Revolution to now and asks, why is nobody learning anything from our mistakes with salmon rivers? Hope you enjoy. This episode of the Sustainable Angler Podcast is brought to you by Emerger Strategies, a sustainable business consultancy whose mission is to solve the climate crisis by helping your business go zero waste and carbon neutral. To learn more, visit emergerstrategies.com. I have a sustainable business consultancy that I target companies in the fly fishing industry and work with them to go zero waste and carbon neutral. And obviously I fly fish. It's kind of married my passion for fly fishing and the environment. And
is there fly fishing in South Carolina?
Oh, absolutely.
Just trout or?
Well, here on the coast, we fly fish for redfish and or some people call them spot-tailed bass. But
is that the redfish that they eat in New Orleans?
That's exactly right, the blackened redfish.
Right.
And what we have here in Charleston, you can catch them anytime and year-round, but the most fun on the fly is during the spring, summer, and fall. Particularly the fall's the best. But our average tidal swing is 5 feet, and a couple days approaching a full moon or a new moon, and after we have what's called flood tides. So our tide gets up to 6 feet, and whenever that happens, our marshes flood, and those redfish come into the grass to escape their predators, but also eat fiddler crabs and shrimp and everything else that's in the marsh.
So they're not insectivores.
Right, exactly. And so
you use flies that imitate crustaceans and things like that?
Exactly. And so whenever they're in the marsh grass, their tails come out of the water. So it's much more like hunting because you're stalking a fish that you can see the direction that it's going, its tail's moving, and try and put the fly in front of its face along its path while it's eating.
Funny. And you can stalk them and they don't sense you're there?
I kayak, so I'll get out of my kayak and wade. And so I do that, pretty stealthily, but also I'll be looking out 20, 30 feet in front of me, and we'll look down and there'll be one just standing right next to you. You're like, I could pick this thing up by the tail right now.
Right.
And then all of a sudden they do realize that you're there and they spook, and it kind of ruins the fishing. But
I've had that experience with trout when you think, isn't this fly fishing silly? I mean, the thing's right there. We can just pick it up.
All I got to do is put it in front of its face and it'll eat.
I was for the hell of it. I was fishing in Idaho, and this trout was just nibbling at something right against the bank, and I was standing on the bank. So I just dangled my fly and moved the rod, 20 degrees over, and it landed trout.
That's awesome. Yeah, I know some guys that have done that off of on the bow of a flat skiff with a redfish, where they were looking out and it was right next to the boat, and they just dipped their fly in the water and it ate it.
They just never learn, even with that catch and release,
Hey, I love it when they're dumb. That's.
I do think with catch and release they get smarter. Trout, anyway.
I think so. I think the redfish here, it's noticeably different. And I'm from Savannah, which is a couple hours south of Charleston, and it's noticeably different, the pressure you get in Charleston versus Savannah, and they don't see as many flies. It's just a they just seem to come to the hand a little bit more easily down there.
Right.
So
like, according to Jimmy Carter, the fly fishing zone begins somewhere around Atlanta.
yeah.
He said that he never fly fished growing up in Georgia because he was in southern Georgia, and then when he became governor, went to Atlanta. That's when he first started learning about fly fishing.
It used to be that way, and I mean, I grew up in Savannah and really never even heard of fly fishing. And then I lived out in Wyoming for a few years, and in Colorado, and got into fly fishing, and came back, and it was just like a whole new world opened up with saltwater fly fishing that I just didn't really even know existed.
Right. Well, I come from New England, and when I was growing up, nobody fly fished in salt water, and now it's a big thing.
Oh, absolutely.
Fly fishing for striped bass and things like that.
Yeah, the whole striped bass, redfish, tarpon. I mean, it's a big popular thing down here now, which is, in my mind, good. I feel like the more fly anglers there are, the more stewards there will be, hopefully.
Well, I think that's true, and the sport's growing a lot. Interestingly, it's growing largely because of women.
Yeah, that's what I hear too. That they're getting really into it, which is great.
It was really interesting because my daughter is a ballet dancer. She's 19 now, but she's been dancing since, I don't know, she was 2 or something. And when I first took her fly fishing, I guess maybe she was 6 or 7, and she got it immediately. And you could show her anything. You didn't even have to show her. You'd say, "This is what mending is." You tell her, and she'd do it perfectly. Or drag a roll cast, and she'd do it perfectly because she was used to following instructions for physical moves.
Right.
And also, I mean, she was so much better than me. I mean, she rarely lost a fish that hit, and I think that's it's hand-eye coordination, and I think kids have better hand-eye coordination than we do anyway. But the coordination that it takes for ballet. What's her name? Wolf's wife. You know what I'm talking about? Lee Wolf's wife.
Joan.
Joan, yes.
Yeah.
She was a dancer.
Oh, yeah, interesting.
She grew up as a dancer, and she wrote about this, how dancing was such a great training for fly fishing.
Really? That's interesting.
Yeah. But I could see that immediately with my daughter.
Well, I'm just fingers crossed she I don't want to force it on her, but if she gets into this, then it is I'm looking forward to many more days on the water with her. I took her fishing in Wyoming for the first time this past summer. She was just in my little backpack, and I'd catch a fish. And
where were you fishing?
And Jackson Halls, where my wife and I used to live out there before we moved back east. And
fishing for cutthroats.
Just me and her, just me and my daughter, and she handled it like a pro and was laughing every time. She'd get real quiet when I'd hook a fish and was observing, and then I'd put the fish in her face and she'd start laughing. So hoping to ingrain these in her memory early of good times in fishing.
Right. So, my salmon book is published by Patagonia.
Yeah. Yep.
And Yvon Chouinard, who founded Patagonia, is one of the world's great fly fishermen.
Oh, absolutely.
And he took me fishing, and he has a place outside of Jackson, and he took me fishing on the Snake, with, it looked just like that famous Ansel Adams photograph, where you see the Grand Tetons up at the end of the Snake. Just really beautiful. The funny thing was that he, he's been pushing these Tenkara rods. Patagonia sells them now. And, Tenkara rods?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, so he got me to fish with one, which you can do with a cutthroat.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, yeah.
I'm not sure you could do it with a rainbow, and you sure as hell couldn't do it with a salmon. But, because you can't run.
Right. Yeah, there's no...
Yvonne says you just throw the rod in the water, but I'm not really sure how that's going to work. But so we were fishing on this one bank of the Snake and not doing very well. And it looked obvious that the other bank is where we wanted to be. So we crossed over. And as soon as we crossed over, we realized that we were actually in the Grand Teton National Park. And the first thing that happened was a ranger came up and asked for our licenses. And my license had expired because I was fishing an extra day and hadn't been planning on fishing that day.
Okay.
So I told him I have an expired license. I don't have a license for today. And he looked at me and he said, "Well, I'm not going to fine you because you don't have a fly rod."
Ah.
He didn't recognize this Tinkara thing as a fly rod.
Tinkara saves the day. That's awesome. Let's dive in a little bit on salmon, Mark.
Yep.
I have admittedly have not done a lot of salmon fishing. I have done it a couple of days in upstate New York at Tailwater Lodge, but those were, I guess you wouldn't call them sea run, I guess, but
they're fake salmon.
Yeah, basically. But that's the extent of my salmon fishing. But I do know, based on just that they're an indicator species that can help to determine a lot about the health. And I know a little bit about it. I know that you know a ton about it. So I wanted to get things kicked off with sort of maybe just the background on why you chose to write about salmon, and let's just go from there.
Sure. So in 1997, I came out with a book about the Atlantic cod. And this book came out around the time that the northern stock of cod in the Canadian Grand Banks collapsed. And really, for the first time, people started talking about overfishing and fishing management. By people, I mean the general public, because I worked as a commercial fisherman when I was a kid in the 60s, and that's all fishermen talked about. But the general public was not really very aware of this. And then they became extremely aware of it. And they tend to think that that is the major problem with fisheries. And it became clear to me as I followed this that it wasn't, that you had to ask why, after severely restricting fishing in the Gulf of Maine, cod wasn't coming back, or why, I mean, salmon, my God, Atlantic salmon, there's hardly any commercial fishing of Atlantic salmon left, and salmon is still doing poorly. And what's clear is that there's a lot of things going wrong besides overfishing and bad fishery management. And even in places with good fishery management, things aren't going well. And that, in fact, if you could find, and I'm not sure you can, but if you could find a fishery where the only problem was overfishing, that would be great. I mean,
right.
Relatively, that's such a simple problem, where you could just fix it by fishing less. That almost never happens. There's so many other things. And I thought that salmon was the best way to talk about this, because it's an anadromous fish in freshwater and going to sea. So it gets hit with just about everything that we do wrong. And in fact, nowadays, there isn't really a lot of mismanagement and overfishing of salmon. And it's still doing very poorly because of deforestation and urban sprawl and pollution and insecticides and bad agricultural practices and dams and climate change and climate change and climate change. Um,
and that is the basically it's I think it's what they call a wicked problem, right? Where there's so many different things that are affecting it.
right.
Um,
It's like everything we're doing wrong. So there's two ways of looking at this. You could either save salmon by saving the earth, or you could save the earth by saving salmon. You can approach it either way.
That's awesome. So you look at this list of problems, right? You know, as you mentioned, there's overfishing, of course. There's urban sprawl. There's insecticides. But you mentioned climate change 3 times. Why is that?
Because climate change is really the big one. And although I was very concerned about climate change all along, nothing has brought it home to me as much as looking at salmon, is the implications. So you could start with the fact that a salmon cannot live and will not reproduce in water that is warmer than 68 degrees. So last summer in Alaska, there were huge runs, tremendous runs, millions and millions, and a lot of them just died without spawning because the water was too warm. They had an unusually warm summer in Alaska, a summer like they've never had before. So that's one of the simple problems
Right.
of climate change. There's many others. There's the fact that predator fish that, because nature had this all worked out. So there would be these fish, like striped bass. Striped bass is also an anadromous fish and will eat pretty much anything in the river. So striped bass don't generally go in, there are exceptions, but generally they don't go in the same rivers as salmon, because when they do, they eat all the parr, the young salmon. But now with climate change, stripers are roaming much further north, and they're going into rivers and in Labrador and Newfoundland and northern places, and destroying the salmon runs. But the biggest example of what climate change is doing, and this is the one that is really most disturbing to me. I went to salmon places to talk to river managers all over the North Atlantic, in New England and in Iceland and Ireland and Scotland and Norway, and and these are places that have little or none of commercial fishing. It's almost completely eliminated. And everywhere I went, people would talk about how, the salmon come into the rivers, they spawn, the parrs develop in the rivers, they go out to sea, and they never see them again. Or very few of them are returning. They were returning at a much lower rate. In some cases, like the Connecticut River, they were unable, after spending billions of dollars in a few decades, they were unable to restore the Connecticut River, in part partly because there's too many dams, but also so few, hardly any of the fish that made it to sea ever returned. And what is going on is that carbon dioxide loves water. So about a third of the carbon dioxide that's produced ends up in the ocean. And when it goes in the ocean, it impacts on hydrogen. And the result of this hydrogen carbon imbalance is that a lot of things don't grow as well as they used to. Coral, for example, but that's not a salmon problem, but zooplankton and capelin, it's all just much smaller. And capelin is one of the basic fish of salmon, and by the way, also cod. Um, and they just aren't growing to the size they used to, and zooplankton isn't producing nearly the nutrition that it used to. And so what is happening is that the North Atlantic is losing its carrying capacity. It is losing its ability to feed the animals that live in it. And that is about the scariest thing I've ever learned. I mean, if the ocean can no longer feed the animals that live in it, we are sunk.
Right. That's terrifying.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
And this is happening just a couple things that I just want to touch on, which is maybe it's totally unrelated, maybe it's not, but it does seem to be a specific number. You mentioned 68 degrees the salmon won't spawn because the water's too warm, right?
Right.
What's interesting, and I don't have scientific evidence to back this up, so I'll preface this by saying that. But what I've always been told with redfish here in Charleston is they're not going to feed, that the crabs don't come out until the water's 68 degrees. So you can't fish for redfish until the water gets to 68 degrees. So who knows if that's a correlation, but I thought that was interesting. But
so maybe scientists are just stuck on the number 68, and it could be 65 or 69.
yeah, maybe so. But so anyway, that's a little bit off topic, but I thought that was kind of interesting. But what we're also seeing here, and I'm bringing this up just to sort of make it relatable for everyone that this is happening everywhere, is we see it in our crustaceans down here, in our shrimp populations, and that what you mentioned with some of these smaller animals, although shrimp are much bigger than zooplankton, there's the little things that have the impact throughout the entire web. And that is what is terrifying, right? Is that this is happening now. So I guess a question I would have is, as you mentioned earlier, is, we can save salmon to save the earth. How do we do that? How do we make that happen?
Oh, it's easy. If you look at this pandemic, coronavirus, and what are people doing for the most part? They're doing what they have to do, regardless of the impact on the economy, regardless of the impact on their lives. Whatever it is they have to do, they will do it, because they have to confront this incredibly destructive thing. That is the way we have to think about climate change. I'm not saying that we do the exact same things as we do for the pandemic, but that kind of mentality. We have to do what needs to be done. We have to greatly reduce carbon, and in a lot of cases, it's not about shutting things down like the pandemic. It's about working on alternatives.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't produce carbon, you can still even produce energy that doesn't produce carbon. You can drive cars that aren't using fossil fuel. You can, we did all this stuff. We solved all our technical problems with no thoughts about what we were doing to the planet, and we came up with the wrong solutions. Now we have to go back and come up with solutions that will work.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's that's a big part of this. Is okay, well, I see climate change is obviously the most significant threat to our fisheries. But
look, I mean, look at it this way. I had this moment, this kind of aha moment when working on this book. People always want writers to have an aha moment. It's a standard interview question, and I usually don't have one. But So I was working on this book, and I was working on the history of salmon, going back to ancient times. And there were certain clear problems that kept coming up. Obviously, blocking rivers wasn't good. And even in the Middle Ages, there were lots of ordinances against blocking rivers. And the Magna Carta barred the King of England from blocking salmon rivers.
Okay.
So this problem was understood. But what happened was the Industrial Revolution. In the Industrial Revolution, all of these mills were built. They were built by rivers because rivers had power. And so dams were built on the rivers to power the mills. So now you have the rivers completely blocked. Added to which the mills dumped all their pollution back in the rivers. And in not a lot of time, they completely destroyed all the rivers of Britain. And in New England, they did the same thing. Ironically, almost the same people, and people of British origin did the exact same thing. And then looking at the Pacific Northwest, which was a very economically unproductive area, but the rivers were fantastically powerful. People like Lewis and Clark were just astounded by how much more powerful Western rivers are than Eastern rivers. And they got this idea that you could build dams and produce a tremendous amount of hydroelectric power and build an economy based on that. And they did that and destroyed the Columbia River and a lot of other rivers in the process. So I'm researching this and I'm thinking, well, why is it nobody's ever learning anything? And then I realized, this was my aha moment, I realized that nobody's trying to learn anything. They were setting out to accomplish what they did. England was the greatest industrial power of the Industrial Revolution in the world. New England became the greatest industrial center of North America. The Pacific Northwest produced more power than any place else in North America and built this huge economy on it. These are all great success stories, except that they're destroying the planet.
All right. Small footnote.
Right. So you're asking me what has to be done. What has to be done is we need to rethink the whole notion of economic development. I'm not saying, no one is saying that we shouldn't have economic development, that we shouldn't build things and provide jobs. There are people, notably in the Republican Party, who are often saying this, that you can't do these anti-climate change or environmental things because it'll just take away jobs. Well, nothing says that you can't have economic development that provides jobs. You just have to change your whole concept of economic development. And that's what has to be done.
Yeah, I think that I think that first off, that's an amazing aha moment that well, no one's trying to solve anything. But to your point, I also think that climate change can, and I personally think could be the greatest economic opportunity that there is, because we could transition our economy to a clean, renewable economy, and that would create jobs, and that would provide people to service those. It would create jobs and transitioning over to a clean, renewable energy economy, and that would be the definition of.
You know what? I was talking to an important financial advisor, won't name the firm or the person. And what we were talking about is the fact that oil companies are no longer great investments. And that if you want an investment with a future, you should look into some of these companies that are producing alternative energy.
Exactly. Yeah.
A shift is taking place.
Yeah. It's starting to happen, I think. But
and if the United States sits back and lets Germany and other countries take the lead in producing solar and wind turbines and all of these things, they will have lost out on a huge economic opportunity for the U.S.
Yep, I agree. And well, let me, a question that I had, because I know that you've also written, you mentioned cod and obviously salmon, oysters even, and because I'm an oyster lover here in the Low Country, and I'm curious. It seems like there's a common theme of delving into the history and how it has impacted these species. Do you find commonalities in all of them, where the same thing is happening to all these species for the same reasons, or are they totally different?
Well, they're certainly not totally different. They're different. What they have in common is the short-sightedness of human beings. You know, I was giving a talk at an elementary school in Brooklyn, and I was talking about my oyster book. Not that elementary school kids are going to be reading that book, but the school was interested in me talking about the ideas that were in there. And I was talking about how, and basically that book is it's about urban pollution. It's about how New York City destroyed its harbor. And I was talking about how various oyster beds would have to be closed down because they were making people sick because of pollution, mainly raw sewage. It took a remarkable amount of time before people understood that dumping raw sewage on your food would make you ill. And I was talking about how what happened is, Pasteur and Koch and these people came along that understood about microbes. And then there was the ability, when there was an outbreak, when there was an epidemic, to trace it to its source. And it kept getting traced to one oyster bed or another. And then they would close down that oyster bed. And every time they closed down an oyster bed, I mean, you can go and look this up, all the New York newspapers, there used to be a lot of them, would have huge front page articles on how this bed was closed down because of this pollution, and how we have to stop doing this or it's going to be a disaster. And yet they kept doing it. And this little boy raised his hand politely, and I called on him. He said, "Isn't this exactly what's happening with climate change?" This is why I love talking to kids.
Yeah, it is. So essentially, our short-sightedness and our inability to learn from our mistakes or have a desire to learn from those mistakes is a big part of the problem.
Yeah, I mean, something that's happening that might be a cause for optimism is that more and more people are understanding the consequences of doing these damaging things. Whereas throughout history, they did them, and there were, rare people who talked about how damaging this was. There were a few notable writers like Charles Dickens talked about how they were destroying the British rivers. And, there were people who knew and understood, but by and large, people weren't bothering about this. And more and more people are bothering about it now, and that's a good sign.
Yeah, I was going to also ask on that note, because one of the things that I do try and climate change is a major topic on this podcast, and how it impacts our fisheries. And one of the things that I do always like to try and do is share some success stories or some sense of hope. Are there any salmon success stories out there that?
Well, there's some success with other problems.
Okay, let's talk about that.
I don't see climate change being solved. I mean, there are some attempts. There's some native tribes that are growing forests that will trap some of the carbon, but this is a pretty small scale solution. They are trying to reforest some rivers. Deforestation is a huge problem for salmon rivers because, first of all, the woods, having wooded banks, holds the banks in place. So you can see on a river like the River Dee in Scotland, which is mostly deforested but still has some forested parts. In the forested parts, it's much deeper, narrower, and faster. The river tends to spread out when it doesn't have forests holding the banks. But also these forests provide nutrition for the river and for the animals in the river. And it provides shades. I mean, remember that 68 degrees, one thing salmon can do is go to the shaded parts of the rivers. Good fishing tip, by the way.
Noted.
Salmon don't like sunny stretches. And also rivers, especially first growth forests, huge trees would fall in the river. And, as a fly fisherman, you'll appreciate the value of this. What happens to these huge things in the river is they create all sorts of pools and channels and habitat for salmonids. So reforesting is a very important thing. And there's attempts to cut down on pollution, and more thought is being given to agricultural processes. The problem with agriculture, if you're concerned with fish, agriculture is a problem, because I look at this throughout history in Japan and in California and everywhere. When there's a conflict between agriculture and fish, the fish lose. So for example, they destroyed rivers in Japan to irrigate for rice paddies, flood rice paddies. It was a disaster for the rivers, but it produced the rice. You see this everywhere. And cattle raising is often destructive of rivers. And people are starting to rethink that also. There again, I'm not saying that you shouldn't have agriculture. I'm just saying that you have to take care of how you do it.
Right. And not only with agriculture, because you are in some cases cutting down land to plant food, which obviously we need food to eat, but it also, you mentioned earlier, and I assume that you're talking about pesticides from agriculture or
agricultural runoff. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Pesticides really kill salmon. For example, in Atlantic Canada, they had a huge DDT program to kill off insects that were impacting on the forest, because the forestry industry was very important to the economy. And these pesticides were really destructive to the rivers. But another good thing that's happening is some dams are actually being torn down. Now, I got to be realistic about this. Nobody's tearing down dams that play an important role in the local economy.
Right.
But there are a lot of dams that aren't used very much anymore, and sometimes not at all. I mean, New England is just full of dams that they were built for mills and textile mills. And what are these textile mills doing now? They're boutique bistros and things like
that. This is very true.
So some dams have been torn down with some real success. The thing you always have to be aware of, whether you're tearing down dams or, trying to rebuild with hatcheries, which is a very dubious enterprise, the thing you always have to be aware of is that nothing does any good unless you restore the habitat. The river has to have a favorable habitat for the salmon, or nothing you do will do any good. So a river like the Penobscot in Maine, they tore down a couple of dams, but before they did that, they cleaned up the river. Had they not cleaned up the river, it would have been pointless.
Interesting. And that makes a ton of sense. I mean, when you lay it out like that, but that's
habitat is the entire key. It is why Native Americans could fish salmon very hard, and they did fish it hard. It's a myth that they didn't do much because they were, not a commercial people and not very economically developed. They fished very hard, and they used it as a commodity of trade from one village to another. And they never destroyed the runs because they never destroyed the rivers.
And
there's an idea in most Native American cultures that when nature provides food for you, this is a gift you're being given, and you have to be kind and respectful to people who give you a gift, right?
Again, also seems like common sense, but
right. So if you're not kind to the rivers, they won't give you any more salmon.
Well, it's simple, but it's pretty profound, right? Because it makes all the difference. All right, so let's see, Mark. We've covered some ground. I mean, we've talked about Salmon, the book, which is available through your website and Patagonia, I guess, I would assume.
It's available through my website, through Patagonia, through bookstore.com.
Okay.
Which is a site that was designed to help out bookstores. It will get you the book from a local bookstore. Bookstores, they're still there and they're still paying their rent, but nobody's going into their stores, so they're really suffering, and they're trying to find ways of selling books online. So you can do that. You can also probably find a website for your local bookstore and buy the book online.
Yep. All right, so we talked about one of your books, though, that I would like to, which I know we're talking about salmon. And by the way, the title of the book is Salmon, A Fish, the Earth, and the History of Their Common Fate. So that's primarily what we're talking about. But because some of the volunteer work I do, we work with our local South Carolina DNR to recycle oyster shells to create new reefs.
Uh-huh.
So that the oysters have something to attach themselves to, and the idea is that you're then cleaning the water, enhancing the fishery, and it's kind of a virtuous cycle.
Right. There's a huge oyster planting project in New York Harbor.
Yeah, I think I've heard it's like 1 million oysters or something.
Billion.
Yeah, a billion. Okay.
Not that there are a billion, but that's the goal, and that's the name of the project.
Yeah. I think I've heard of that, and so I would just be curious if you had, just because, I mean, the amount of research and everything that you've done for your books, it's been incredible. What have been some of the takeaways in restoring oyster populations, if you have any of that that's still top of mind?
Well, there again, like what I was saying about salmon and rivers, it's all about habitat.
Yep.
The water has to be a good enough quality for the oysters to grow, but it also has to be a good enough quality for the oysters to be edible. So in New York, which was one of the great oyster centers of the world, the oysters became too affected by pollution and dangerous to eat. And then then it was closed down, but the water got even worse, and it got to the point where oysters wouldn't even grow in New York. and they cleaned it up, and now they will grow, and now there are oyster beds, but you can't eat them because there's still heavy metals and PCBs in the water. So, if you really want to bring oysters back, you really got to bring the water back first.
Yep. Interesting. And that's been, and it has that been habitat, it seems, has been the common theme in bringing any of these back, but they have these existential threats that are happening to them, to their habitat, such as climate change and runoff and sprawl and things of that nature. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, rivers there's this huge dead zone in the mouth of the Mississippi River because the Mississippi River dumps so much pollution in. We have to address these things.
Yeah, and that's something that. So the way that my feeble mind has had to try and simplify this is kind of what I call when it comes to fisheries, there's really three, to really just simplify it, there is what I call the 3 Ps. So there's population, pollution, and policy. And within those are a number of other things. So population, overfishing, pollution in the form of CO2, in the form of plastic, in the form of runoff. And then policy, such as Magnuson-Stevens Act, or a number of other different policies that will influence things like climate or fisheries management.
Right.
And
where you really start getting change is if you can get people behind these policies,
mm-hmm.
so that it's not just seen as something government is imposing on them.
Yeah. Yeah, what's interesting, I did an interview and we talked about that. They're like, if you really want to keep government off your back, you should solve climate change, because then you're going to forcibly close things down.
It's what was it, Alexander Hamilton, I believe, if men were angels, we would need no government.
Right.
So the more angelic you are, the less government you're going to have.
So we mentioned that we can find salmon, fish the earth, and the history of their common fate on your website, which is markkurlansky.com, also on Patagonia, and also on bookstore.com if you want to.
Or on the website of your local bookstore. I know. I try to buy from Friend Books and Books in Miami has a good website. Booksmiths in Brookline and Boston has a good website. These just happen to be places I know, but there's good websites for lots of bookstores. Let's try to help out independent bookstores because they're hurting right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
When this is all over, I want those stores to still be there.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Well, Mark, I really do appreciate your time and your expertise, and ultimately what you discovered in this book and in others. And I really do, I really do appreciate you carving some time out for me.
Yeah, well, it was a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Sustainable Angler Podcast, and special thanks to Mark Kurlansky. I really learned a lot and had a great time on this interview. If you want more episodes of the Sustainable Angler, you can find them anywhere you listen to your podcast. So give us a follow, rating, and review. That helps the show out a lot. Thanks.